The economy is falling apart at the seams. We can see that. And you say this, and many analysts and economists confirm it. How does this affect Putin's inner circle, in your opinion? There are two possible scenarios here. Either they will, roughly speaking, rot away alongside him, remain blind to what is happening, and move toward isolating themselves by following the North Korean scenario. Or there's the possibility of some kind of palace coup, so to speak.
And exactly as if on cue, Venezuela comes into play.
And
it truly appears to me that what happened in Venezuela will profoundly impact the internal elite consensus. So hard, it's going to be absolutely and utterly devastating. When they see that you can simply give up the top leader, so to speak, and even manage to stay in power. Yes, of course, some concessions will have to be made. In Venezuela, political prisoners have already been released. I think there will be more things like that. I'm sure that in the end, the opposition will somehow be included in the current government. So in other words, a kind of soft transition will begin as I see it. I'm talking about Venezuela. And of course, the Russian elite is watching. So there are two options. Either lose everything completely, forget about all your villas, all your bank accounts, and everything, absolutely everything. Or leave, as some businessmen are doing. Already now, people are leaving for the West and abandoning everything they have in Russia, selling it for next to nothing. Or, after all, to stage a palace coup. And it seems to me that these thoughts will come to the Russian elite more and more often. Well, as they say, our task is this: to reinforce these thoughts in their minds as much as possible.
I suspect that these so-called Russian elites are also closely monitoring what's happening in China these days, because there's another grand, large-scale purge going on there. This time, it's the high-ranking military generals who are being targeted, and this serves as a cautionary lesson to Putin's inner circle, doesn't it? In a year or two, the same could happen to you, when this power-hungry dictator starts to doubt you, and this too should plant some seeds of doubt, to sow them among their ranks.
You don't even need to examine the complexities of China. You just have to look closely at Soviet history and see how Soviet dictators systematically eliminated their own elite, because that's the fundamental and inescapable reality of life under a dictatorship. A dictatorship will always purge, first and foremost, those who are closest to the throne. And absolutely no one ever possesses any guarantee of safety, no matter how close they are to Putin today. And all of this, of course, needs to be processed in their minds and turned into something. But I'll repeat once again, our task is to do everything we can to accelerate these processes in their minds.
What do you think? Did people in Putin's inner circle hear Zelensky's New Year's address when he voiced the dream of every Ukrainian that he would finally die? At last? In 2026, have they started thinking about anything like that? Yes? And is it possible at any level, any kind of preparation for a transition of power after Putin? Well, roughly speaking, what successors are there in reality? Do such candidates exist today?
You know, I wouldn't talk about potential successors or future leaders at all today, because it will depend entirely on how the transition process actually takes place. Any successor who is named before the right moment, before this very transition begins, will immediately either be politically eliminated or put in prison. And in fact, all of these complex circumstances will be stopped quite quickly. Just observe the intense hysteria that broke out in the Kremlin after the establishment of the Russian opposition platform in PACE.
That is,
when an independent group of negotiators appeared, completely disconnected in any way with the current Russian authorities. In fact, standing firmly in direct opposition, there was just an uncontrollable and wild hysteria. Not only that, they even tried sending some of their emissaries into PACE, even to inappropriately influence someone. And I am not afraid of this word.
You can even name these people's last names if you are ready to do so. But they say that this process was personally supervised by, not Medinsky, Kozak, I don't remember. So, in other words, the Kremlin tried hard and really wanted to plant its agents within the Russian opposition platform delegations.
I wouldn't be surprised if maybe they even managed to do something, but I think it was only to a minimal extent. Because after all, it's quite enough. Many of the people who ended up in the platform are quite strongly opposed to the current regime. So I think that...
Olga, excuse me, but the Russian opposition in exile, not you, of course, and this is not directed at you personally, but very often it suffers from having a hardline stance toward Putin. But not toward the war started by Putin. That is, it does not openly take a stand. This is a pro-Ukrainian force. So, are there many people who will be useful to Ukraine who have now joined PACE?
We'll have to look specifically and carefully at the voting results. Right now, in my opinion, the balance is approximately 50-50 of those you are talking about. There are some individuals who are staunchly pro-Ukrainian in their views, and then there are those who maintain a fairly independent position. Well, for example, Oleg Orlov from the Memorial Organization is also a fairly reasonable person with a very balanced position. And I can't really call him completely pro-Ukrainian, but it seems to me that with his extensive experience and background, he will likely bring a unique perspective to the situation. It is important to make well-balanced and thoughtful decisions, I would say. As for the possible agents, there was a highly engaging and informative speech, followed by a comprehensive and detailed interview. Natalia Moseichuk interviewed Denis Kapustin on Atrex, and he discussed agents of influence, stating that the highest form, the greatest achievement of intelligence work, is the strategic infiltration of their own agents of influence, into high leadership positions in opposition organizations. And he named Leonid Volkov as such an agent of influence. Probably many people have already read what Leonid Volkov said about White Rex himself, back when we all thought he had passed away, and about his loyal comrades in arms, and about the intelligence chief Kirilo Budanov, and also about the official Andriy Yermak. And what he said aligned so closely with the official narratives coming from the Kremlin that it seems to me these agents are exposing themselves so blatantly that it's becoming obvious to almost everyone. Why do I say almost? Because unfortunately there is still a group of the dedicated supporters of the FBK who, in my personal opinion, still try not to notice such glaringly obvious and undeniable facts. And of course, what Leonid Volkov is doing right now is so profoundly damaging and destructive, both for the FBK itself, because in my view, he is simply nullifying the entire legacy of Alexei Navalny, and for the whole of the Russian opposition, and it unintentionally provides significant assistance to the Kremlin. There are simply no words left for this, but I think the Lithuanian authorities are now considering whether to extend or, on the contrary, revoke his residence permit. So let's take a closer look at how this story comes to an end. I want to make sure that everyone here has a clear and thorough understanding of exactly what this situation is all about. The point is that we are in a state of war, and Leonid Volkov right now, from an objective point of view, in fact, he is actively and consistently supporting the Kremlin in its aggressive stance. Well, as for the underlying reasons as to why he is doing this, let each of our viewers decide and conclude for themselves.
I would ask the question, why is the Russian Federation now opening up its sleeper agents with such intensity? After all, we both understand perfectly well that whether it's a useful idiot, skillfully manipulated, or an outright agent, yes, any such agent is supposed to play the long game. That's where their value lies. Yes, all the seeds of doubt, we know very well how this propaganda war is waged. But when they expose their assets so brazenly, openly, and quickly, I think that also points to some kind of panic within the regime.
Undoubtedly, this is exactly what we were just discussing. Why did things suddenly change the negotiating position of the Russian delegation. And for exactly the same reason, that's why the Kremlin sleeper agents are being exposed so intensively, because apparently they believe that the situation, and that's why they're bombing Ukraine on the fly. They believe that the stage of the war is so critical that if they don't resort to deception now, there will be defeat. And this is something we need to understand. And here again, I support General Kellogg. The main thing is to hold out for just one more day and one more night. And in fact, the way they're being exposed should convince us that we're moving in the right direction.
Olga, recently these ghouls also branded you with the status of foreign agent. How did you take this news? I'm surprised it happened so late because, well, you are one of the most prominent critics of both Putin and the Putin regime and of this war. And you've always placed the emphasis exactly where it belongs. You don't have a hidden agenda, there are no double meanings with you. And you have always been sincerely and consistently supportive of the armed forces of Ukraine and every single aspect associated with this war. What exactly has changed since then? And again,
we have the same answer again. I used to wonder why they don't recognize me as a foreign agent. Because, well, that's how it happened. A separate question is why. I won't even, so to speak, push this issue now. An attentive viewer will understand why. I am almost never on Russian airwaves. Most of my broadcasts are on Ukrainian channels, on various Ukrainian channels. And it appeared to me that the Kremlin didn't consider me a particularly dangerous political player because I do not specifically work for the Russian audience. Well, not to the same extent as the others. And suddenly something changed. What? And here we come to another important point. We've already talked with you about the Russian platform of PACE. And our organization, the Forum of Russian Opposition in Support of Ukraine, of which I am the secretary, put forward its own candidates for this very platform. And two of our candidates, Andrei Volna and Mark Feigin, became members of this platform. It appears quite clearly that our activities have become increasingly hazardous and threatening for the Kremlin. And since I play a certain significant organizational role there, they decided to swiftly and decisively clamp down on me. But again, this clearly demonstrates that we are indeed moving in the right direction. And notice this was the very first group this year, and on the following Friday, absolutely no new foreign agents appeared at all. So in a way, they decided to strike just like they fire their weapons while they are on the move. That means we are really stepping on their tail and we are causing them a significant amount of trouble. Well, and that's a good thing.
You're on the right path. Olga, thank you. Thank you for what you do. Thank you for not giving up the fight. From our personal conversations, I remember and know how much you've lost. And just think about what kinds of queens they tried to tempt you with in the Russian Federation, just to make you abandon your principles, betray your opposition views, and start working for the authorities, or at least remain silent. Mokhob. So honor and praise to you for your choice and for the important work you are doing now.
One of Vladimir Putin's closest aides refused to comply with his direct orders on the second day of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This refers to Dmitry Kozak, the former deputy head of the Russian presidential administration. According to the New York Times, citing 3 people close to Kozak, Putin instructed his senior aide to formally demand Ukraine's surrender. Kozak reportedly refused, insisting that he did not understand what the Russian leader was trying to achieve with this invasion. As the conversation grew more heated, Kozak told Putin that he was prepared to be arrested or even shot for his refusal to comply. According to sources, it was only later that Kozak learned that in 2022, Putin had put the conversation on speakerphone, turning high-ranking officials of the presidential administration into witnesses of this rare act of defiance. Konstantin Zatulin, a member of parliament from President Vladimir Putin's United Russia Party, who personally knows Dmitry Kozak, described him as someone who remains consistently loyal to Putin. However, he noted that Kozak does not hide his opinions. In the presidential administration, it is not customary to argue with your boss's opinion, Zatulin said. The New York Times notes that Kozak was in fact the only dissenting voice within President Putin's close inner circle. Even before the Russian invasion in early 2022, Kozak was engaged in negotiations with Ukraine about the ongoing war in the eastern part of the country. In January of that same year, he held negotiations in Paris, which sent a very positive signal. Several former Ukrainian and American officials familiar with these confidential talks stated that, in their considered opinion, Putin's aide was genuinely and sincerely seeking a diplomatic solution. Kozak also prepared an extremely detailed and extensive memo, thoroughly outlining the likely negative consequences and ramifications of the war. According to one of those individuals who reportedly saw this important document, it contained a clear and explicit warning about the possible accession of both Sweden and Finland to the NATO alliance. According to several reliable sources, on February 21st, he once again spoke at a formal meeting of the Russian Security Council, and during this address, he stated that the Ukrainians would indeed resist, that anti-Russian sanctions would be particularly severe, and that Russia's overall geopolitical position would likely deteriorate as a result. Some news agencies reported that Kozak made a phone call to Yermak, who was then serving as the head of the Ukrainian president's office, just a few hours after the invasion began, and demanded that Kiev surrender. Kozak himself, however, claims that the situation was actually different. Allegedly, it was Yermak who reportedly called him, and Kozak said that he wanted to achieve a peaceful and lasting settlement through negotiations as quickly as possible. According to three sources close to Kozak, as early as the second day of the invasion, he was negotiating a possible ceasefire with another Ukrainian official, David Arakomia. The agreement provided important security guarantees for Ukraine from Russia and called for the withdrawal of troops from all Ukrainian territory except for Crimea and Donbas. These negotiations in particular angered Putin. According to three independent sources, on the evening of February 25th, Kozak held a detailed briefing for President Putin via the Kremlin's secure telephone system. During this conversation, Putin sharply lashed out at Kozak for overstepping his official authority by discussing sensitive territorial issues and instructed him to inform Kiev that Russia would only negotiate Ukraine's surrender. Kozak felt that Putin was abruptly changing his negotiating position. He said he could not conduct negotiations if he did not know Russia's ultimate goals. Putin brushed off these concerns and ordered Kozak to negotiate according to his instructions. Kozak refused, the article says. According to multiple sources, it was during this conversation that Kozak told President Putin he was fully prepared to be either arrested or even shot for his refusal. On February 26th, President Putin's position on the matter changed for the second time. In the morning, the first deputy head of the presidential administration, Sergei Kiriyenko, informed Kozak that negotiations with Ukraine on behalf of Russia would now be led by another Kremlin aide, Vladimir Medinsky. After the conflict, Kozak kept his office in the presidential administration, but he also proposed some radical changes within the country, ending the war and carrying out a series of liberal reforms, including most notably establishing an independent judiciary.